Kent Hughes.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Com muito prazer.
Com muito prazer.
Kent Hughes, que é do
Com muito prazer.
Olá.
é um brasileiro enrustido.
De coração somente.
Well, good morning to you all. Thank you for coming. I'm Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Brazil Institute and also the program on Science, Technology, America and the Global Economy that is co-sponsored this conference with us. But before I proceed, I wanted to say something about our dear colleague Hala Sfandiari, whom you see in the screen. As you may know, Hala Sfandiari, who is the director of our Middle East program, has been imprisoned in Iran since May 8th at the notorious Evin prison. Iran media reports indicate that she has been charged with espionage against Iran and for involvement in efforts to topple the regime. According to one Iranian spokesperson, the Ministry of Intelligence is the complainant in the case, and we know nothing further about the state of the charges, only what's being reported in the media. What we do know is that these claims are absolutely preposterous and have ignited outrage around the world. Hala Sfandiari is an internationally regarded as a leading scholar on Middle East affairs. She has always been an advocate for increased dialogue between the West and Iran. The work that she has done as director of the Center's Middle East program is publicly available on our website. What she has done here is as secret as what we are doing here right now. It's public. Actually, in this case, is webcast throughout the world. Her work honors the Center's commitment to impartiality, open scholarship, and free expression. I would like to urge you to lend your voice to the many worldwide who are calling upon the Iranian government to release Hala Sfandiari. This evening, a group of us and some people from different parts of the United States and the world are assembling at the UN for a vigil. This is organized by, among others, this vigil has been called by Amnesty International, the American Islamic Congress, the Human Rights Watch Organization, the National Iranian American Council, the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University, and Vital Voices Global Partnership. So we ask you to keep Hala in mind. And every event, we have many events at this Wilson Center, and every event will start with a statement about her until she's freed. And we are very determined to work to see her back to her family and to us here in Washington. Let me, before proceeding with the event of the day, which is Innovation Policies and Business Strategy in Brazil, I have a few announcements to make. We are very glad to announce the Brazil Institute is very glad to announce that we have 3 new members of our advisory council. Pharma, the Association of the Pharmaceutical Industry of the United States, of North America. We have UNICA, who is the Association of the ethanol people from Brazil, who has just this week inaugurated a new president, a person that we know, and is a personal friend of mine, who was here in an important conference we had on biofuels earlier this year, Marcos Young, from the University of São Paulo. He's leaving the university now to assume this new position. Also, Thomas Lovejoy, a pioneer in the studies of the Amazon of biodiversity, has agreed to become a member, and I am also glad to announce that the Brazil Institute has, for the first time, a full-time program assistant in the person of Alan Wright there, who is, like his predecessor, a Brazilian-American son of a Brazilian mother. It's very important. Well, I wanted to thank you very much, the participants, the speakers, especially from those who came from Brazil, to be with us today. This is an event. This is not a single event that we'll do on this issue. I think we do plan to have here this as a starting point of at least 3 events. At least one of them we hope to do in Brazil in the second half of this year. And why are we doing this? Well, because this is an issue that is the utmost importance in Brazil today. We follow the discussion in Brazil. We know that there are studies that have been commissioned by private companies, by the government of Brazil currently. Glauco Arbix, a former president of the Institute of Applied Economics, is actually today, I believe he is returning from Finland to Brazil, where he is conducting a 7-country, he was there as part of a 7-country study on innovation. Is Brazilians going abroad and looking what is happening on this issue. And we wanted to give our small contribution and do what the Brazil Institute and what Stage, the name of the program, run by my dear friend Kent Hughes. What we are supposed to do is to bring themes of public policy that are relevant, in this case to Brazil-US relations, to the discussion here. So I will stop here and I will pass the floor to Kent, who will introduce and moderate the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. We are very fortunate to have an outstanding panel to discuss a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the American press. I can look back on my own youth where, for many Americans, Brazil was really thought of a kind of exotic combination of coffee, Carmen Miranda, and Carnival. And if you watch TCM, Turner Classic Movies, you can still catch Carmen Miranda. The coffee is terrific. Carnival is a unique event, but there is so much more happening in Brazil. Certainly many Americans don't realize that Embraer, the Brazilian-based aeronautics company, is the 3rd largest maker of aircraft in the world. Not long ago, in visiting Brazil, I had an opportunity to visit the electronic data systems company based in Brazil. This is Ross Perot's company that he started many years ago. For several years, EDS Brazil has been hiring an additional 1,000 people. They are providing business services around the world. In fact, more business services outside Brazil than in it. So you can see that, in fact, the old phrase that Brazilians themselves used to use about Brazil being the country of the future and always will be has now really been adapted to where we need to borrow the phrase from George Allen, the former and famous Redskins football coach, that in fact it's beginning to look as though for Brazil the future is now. We have 2 outstanding Brazilian observers and participants in the innovation system, and then 2 outstanding American commentators who have a depth of experience in the American system and will provide some perspective and commentary. Let me introduce first Jorge Avila. Jorge has in the past served as the president of the National Institute for Industrial Property, one of key concerns here in the United States with regard to innovation. He's been the director of the Industrial Development Company of the state of Rio de Janeiro. He has a distinguished academic background, including a PhD in public health and a master's degree in public administration. José Goldenberg, just to his right and your left, is also an extremely distinguished Brazilian. He is currently a full professor and the former rector at the University of Sao Paulo. He is a specialist in physical sciences, a subject I've always found particularly daunting. He has a whole host of significant positions in which he's served. President of the Brazilian Association for the Advancement of Science, President of the Energy Company of the state of Sao Paulo, Secretary of State for Science and Technology, an enormously distinguished career. And to provide some commentary and response, we have two very distinguished Americans. To my right and a bit to your left, next to Jorge Avila, we have Chris Hill. I'm pleased to say that Chris was a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, but that's far from his real claim to fame. He has served in so many key institutions: Congressional Research Service, the Office of Technology Assessment, both key institutions on Capitol Hill. He's a longtime professor of public policy and technology policy at George Mason University. He has had an extensive private sector experience, really brings a host of perspectives. And to Chris's left, or a little bit to my right, is Rob Atkinson. Rob is also extremely distinguished. He is a much published author, as Chris is. A book that I highly recommend is his Past and Future of America's Economy, Long Waves of Innovation That Power Cycles of Growth. It really steps back and looks at the whole sweep of American economic history, putting a focus very much on these cycles of key innovations. Rob has served with distinction in Rhode Island as essentially the Secretary of Economic Development. He has run a very interesting new economy technology program at the Progressive Policy Institute, and is currently the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Each of the speakers will speak for around 10 minutes so that we can stay on schedule and still have time for lots of dialogue and questions from the audience. Let me start with Mr. Avila and then Mr. Goldenberg.
Let me just find my presentation here. Oh, good morning. I'd like first of all to thank Paulo Sotero and the Wilson Center for the kind invitation, for being here, for the opportunity of being in Washington, D.C. And talking about this subject in this town for me is very interesting, because it was the first time I got in touch with science and technology policy was here in Washington, D.C. During a graduate course I had the opportunity to go through in George Washington University. And at that time I was a student, and I learned a lot from Professor Fornortas, who was one of the professors of the Elliott School of Foreign Affairs in George Washington University. So it's interesting to be here again and looking at these subjects from a different perspective. Well, I have the mission of talking about the role of the Brazilian PTO, which is called the INPI, in the promotion of an environment adequate for innovation in Brazil. As I'm the first to talk in this seminar, I think I should before make some remarks on Brazilian innovation system and what's going on in this process, so that we can understand a little bit better what's going on in INPI. I think Brazil now experiences, I think, after 10 years of discussion, a very complete innovation policy. We have had a long tradition of industrial policies. I'm going to talk about this in more detail during the presentation. But an innovation policy is something new in Brazil. I'd say that in the last 10 years, this has been discussed, and only in the last 3 years we effectively have a fully comprehensive innovation policy in the country. And when we say fully comprehensive innovation policy, we mean that the government is taking all the actions which we can design, we can project, in order to build such an environment where companies can dedicate part of their resources to innovate. This is something which is very challenging in Brazil. As we have been able to develop quite comprehensive and diversified industrial environment, but we have not had the tradition of having innovation, a strong innovation in this sector. So to make this shift, to leave the condition of a producer of commodities, of industrial commodities, and become an actor in the scenario of innovation is not an easy task. It's something which we have been, and we keep, part of the policy is setting environments where we can discuss the policy itself, because we really are experiencing what can be done in order to promote innovation. And the changes in the national PTO are part of this effort. Let me go through some slides. I'll talk a little bit about intellectual property, 2 slides, because maybe not all of you are familiarized with the theme, and we have had to develop a quite broad comprehension of what's intellectual property and what's the role of the NPI. Intellectual property in general is sort of things like this. The first of these sentences have to do what we call copyrights. The other 2 are linked to what is usually known as industrial property. Trademarks and patents are the basic tools of the industrial property system, but there are other which are similar and have similar roles. And the copyrights, which are in the first sentence, in truth, they have, in the last years, attended a much more, are becoming much more important to industry. So it's not something that should be seen only as something which is important for the arts, because the companies have to rely a lot on expressions too. And industrial designs in many countries are considered part of the patent system, though in truth they are of the nature of expressions and not of the nature of inventions. In a more abstract way of thinking the intellectual property system, I'd say that one should think of the intellectual property system not as that set of formal tools, but as a system which is designed or should be designed to promote the appropriation of the value of innovation. So any kind of system which promotes somehow the appropriation of value must be sought under the scope of what we call the intellectual property system. So it can be seen as a set of tools to identify in a unique manner a piece of intangible asset, be it knowledge or whatever kind of intangible asset, and making it so clear as possible to everybody that that piece of information, of knowledge, of whatever, belongs to someone, to some company, and that the profits that it generates must flow to that company or to that person. So there's three different manners of seeing or saying what is the intellectual property system. I like very much the last one, which has to do with the idea of a legal framework which regulates somehow transactions which involve knowledge and other intangible assets. When we talk about building an environment which is adequate for innovation, we have to take into account what is to design business strategies. And so we can try to think on intellectual property vis-a-vis business strategies. And when we take a look at these things, we first have the traditional thought about a business strategy has to do with portfolio determination. This means, how do I choose in what businesses my company is going to work at? And this has much to do with the available resources, the opportunities one faces, and with the institutional framework under which these companies are going to have to work. And the intellectual property system is here inside this institutional framework. I'd say that in Brazil, when we say that we have had for many years an industrial development which did not take into account or which did not pay much attention to developing innovative capabilities, part of this must have to do with the lack of some institutional elements which could somehow lead companies in this direction. And we understand that the intellectual property system is part of this and may be a very important part of this set. Of course, what companies are looking for is to build leadership in some fields, and we understand that under what we have been calling the knowledge economy, it's only possible to build leadership if you lead the innovation in the specific segment you want to be leader. So this makes a question for, it's not possible anymore to be strategic without a strategic use of the intellectual property system. And this is what we are trying to do. I'd say that the main contribution INPI can provide in this moment for Brazilian development and for the development of Brazilian industries is to make it possible for these companies to use strategically the intellectual property system, both in the national and in the international levels. When we say strategic use of intellectual property, what we're trying to say is that companies should differentiate, of course, but it's not enough to differentiate. It's necessary to protect what is the result of such differentiation in order to appropriate the economic results of these things. One other aspect of the present environment for innovation worldwide is the openness of the innovation systems. This means companies do not innovate by themselves. Companies rely each time more in the cooperation with other companies, in the cooperation with universities. And in order for these contracts to be able to be established, it's necessary to have a legal framework which provides security for this kind of transactions. So, and this makes a link. We link this to that definition of the intellectual property system as the legal framework, where transactions of this kind can be effectively and securely undertaken. IP portfolio building is something which is rather new for most of the Brazilian companies. Even when we talk about the big Brazilian companies, most of them have had a tradition of building some IP. They have patents, they have trademarks, but what we see when we look at the environment is that they don't have a strategic vision of IP portfolio formation and the ways to deal with these portfolios in the international arena in order to build cooperation for innovation. Again, I think that part of this has much to do with maybe some failures in our institutional framework, which we are trying to solve. Let me talk a little bit on the Brazilian trajectory, which may explain somehow what we are doing now. We have to take into account that during many, many years, Brazil has undertaken an experience of industrial policy which was essentially centered in import substitution. This has to do, this kind of policies have been tried in many countries, and I'd say that probably in Brazil they succeeded quite well. I'd say that Brazil was possibly the country where the import substitution model produced the best results. When one thinks that this model began in the 30s and it was rather successful till the middle of the 80s, and during this very long period, about 50 years, Brazil has grown at an average rate superior to 5%. In some parts of this period at 7% during decades. So this, we cannot say it was an error to adopt such an approach for industrial policy. When we take a look at the industrial park of Latin America, we'll see that Brazilian park is probably, or certainly, the most complete and diversified industrial park, and it has been built under the scope of these institutions. This industrial policy based on import substitution, in truth, was materialized in a set of institutions which made it possible and attractive to build such a diversified industrial environment. But in terms of innovation, it had some problems. When Brazilian economy in the 30s was agrarian economy. It was not an industrial economy, and it was just natural that anyone who sought the ways to develop industry in Brazil thought about learning what's being done elsewhere and bringing this knowledge to the country at the lowest possible cost and building the industry, the national industry. Bringing this knowledge at the lowest possible cost meant essentially that we needed a very weak intellectual property regime. Under this way of thinking, all the knowledge is being produced elsewhere. So we don't really have any strategic need to give much value to knowledge in itself. The cheapest it is, the cheapest it will be to learn and to implement it in the Brazilian environment. But this model has experienced some exhaustion during the 80s, and the country stopped growing. At the same time, we could have already built an endogenous knowledge-producing system. In truth, beginning in the 50s, Brazil started building with our equivalent to NSF, the CNPq, the structuring of a knowledge-producing system in Brazil. And these efforts have been growing from the 50s, and they took a major growth trajectory from the 80s. And we started having a very efficient graduate education system and the beginning of an effective research system in Brazil. This, I'd say that this produced the environment where it was possible to rethink the industrial policy in other terms. We had been able to develop the basic conditions to make an industrial policy based on innovation, and at the same time, the traditional industrial policy based on import substitution presented no more results. So it was time to change, and a new industrial policy, I'd say that it was its very first steps were undertaken in the first governments after the military dictatorship was ended, and the Brazilian economy was opened I'd say that in a very tough way at once, and this produced a lot of troubles and turbulence in the process. but Brazilian economy was effectively opened to the world, and companies were invited to start thinking more consistently on gaining competitivity in international environment. This was during the 90s. By the end of the 90s, a first innovation fostering policy was designed, and in 2004, a first industrial policy centered on innovation and on international competitiveness was established. The role of INPI was then rethought under this new industrial policy. Effectively, when we think of what was the role before, the role of during the impost substitution period, the INPI was devoted to promote the transfer of technology at the lowest possible cost. During the new period, in the new period we are experiencing now, we have a much broader mission for the INPI, which has much to do with the mission of similar institutions in the developed world. That means the theme of this panel, which is to foster innovation and competitiveness by giving value to intangible assets. We see that INPI has a very important role, very central role in this new policy. And because of that, INPI has improved its systems. INPI has grown, has received much more resources to produce what it has to produce in terms of decisions with more efficiency and more quality. We see three basic roles for INPI in this context. First is to help Brazilian society, Brazilian state, to build the IP system. So we are revising, and this is the mission of the institution since its beginning. It has to advise the government in terms of IP legislation and IP treaties, international treaties. So this has been done in a very effective way. The second mission is to promote IP, is to make Brazilian companies, Brazilian citizens be aware of the importance of having an IP portfolio and showing them how to build these portfolios. And the third one is to operate the IP system itself, being efficient and being effective in terms of quality in the operations of INPI. We have designed a strategy with some basic points. The first was to build institutional efficiency. One has to take into account that in 1995, a major shift happened in intellectual property system in international level. It was the creation of WTO and TRIPS agreement established some new rules which had to be implemented by the various countries. This was in truth very in line with what was already happening in Brazil, but this forced some speed in the process, which was not effectively undertaken in that period. That meant some trouble for ANPI. We had to deal with some issues we did not used to deal with, and this produced huge backlogs, which are now being corrected through the apport of these new resources. But we don't favor the time efficiency in detriment of the quality. We think that this would have a bad effect if we started providing bad patents, for instance, which will never provide security for those who hold those titles. So there's a simultaneous concern with time, decisions taken in timely conditions, and the quality of the titles. Introduce IP as the basic institution in any innovation system or innovation policies is something that we are doing so loudly as we can, in terms of explaining people that there is no possible national innovation system without a well-conceived IP system. Try to build a network. INPI in Brazil was isolated. Now it is seen by INPI itself and by the others as part of a system. And we're establishing an Academy of Intellectual Property and Development, which has the purpose of developing knowledge on the relations of IP and development in general. That's it. Thank you very much. Sorry if I took some minutes more than...
Thank you. Very rich presentation. Professor Goldenberg.
Thank you. Can you set me up here? Let me tell you about a new Embraer, which is taking place in Brazil today, which is the ethanol production. As you know, fossil fuels move automobiles and trucks all over the world, and there are limitations to that. There are three types of limitations. The first one is the physical exhaustion of reserves, which will happen sooner or later. The second one is the geopolitics of getting access to these fuels. And the third one are environmental concerns. So I would say that fossil fuels, which changed the world in the 20th century, don't have a very bright future. And therefore, people are looking for substitutes. And one of the substitutes is ethanol, which is a very good fuel which replaces gasoline. It does not replace diesel oil, but it replaces gasoline. But this is known as a technical fact for a very long time. And in the beginning of the 20th century, racing cars used ethanol and methanol at some stage. But then, of course, it was forgotten because it was expensive to produce ethanol except for drinking, and and the amounts of ethanol produced were not very large. And that has changed. And there are two countries which changed that, Brazil first and the United States. In Brazil, ethanol, as you well know, is cachaça, which is becoming it's not only a very popular drink, but it's becoming a sophisticated one. But the important point is the following: is that sugarcane has has been a very important product of Brazil for 200 years for the production of sugar. That's why the Dutch invaded the northeast of Brazil, as you know, because the production of sugar at that time was in the hands of the French Empire. And the Dutch wanted an independent source of sugar. So the production of sugarcane expanded in Brazil, and today, about 25% of the sugarcane in the world is in Brazil. Then the second one is India, and a few others and so on, but Brazil is the leading producer of sugarcane in Brazil. And in the 70s, when the oil crisis started, the government decided that it was high time to reduce imports of oil products. And one of the ways of doing it was to encourage the production of ethanol to replace gasoline, which is one of the products. So it was not a complete solution, but it was a partial solution. And what happened then is that the government subsidized the production of large quantities of ethanol, and Brazil became a large producer of this stuff. And today, Brazil produces about 5 billion gallons of ethanol from sugarcane. And the United States started later, but it produced approximately the same amount from corn. And to produce ethanol from corn is not a very good idea from a technical viewpoint. In addition to that, there are problems of competition between food and fuel. But ethanol in Brazil then progressed very quickly. And what I'm going to show you is an example of innovation in Brazil. This is not a discussion on the ethanol program, but on innovation, what the innovation did. And it's a very interesting case because it was innovation in the private sector. You see, the Brazilian system has a characteristic, which is in science and technology in general and innovation, because the system is a supply-side system. You know, the university system is very strong, and it puts a lot of pressure on the government. It's like the farm lobby in the United States. It gets more money, and the production of doctoral theses in Brazil is very large. Brazil produces, I don't know, 5,000 PhD doctors per year, but it's a supply-side system. And the demand side is way behind. And what's interesting in what I'm going to show you is that the ethanol program introduced innovation rather quickly. And what we are discussing now is where are we? I mean, what are the limits? What are the next steps? Let me show you that. I'm completely illiterate in these things. You know, what shall I press here? I hate computers. You know, having been the Secretary of Science and Technology, which opened Brazil to the era of informatics. You know, let's go back. All right. You know, here you can see what's the situation. Here are the years, 75 and then 2005. And what you see here are three curves. But look at the red one, because I think it's more significant. It's cubic meters of ethanol per hectare. And it started here, and you see about 40 here, and then it grew to approximately 80. So it doubled, approximately doubled in this period of time. So, and there are gains then in liters of ethanol per ton of sugar cane, tons of cane per hectare, and finally cubic meters of ethanol, which is the final product in which you are interested, per hectare. So there was a considerable growth. Where? In the farm area, because due to the selection of better strands and all that and so on, but purely on Mendelian choices. I mean, there is no genetically modified organisms in this business, just selection, traditional selection. And then improvements in the industrial area. And as you see, the gains have been very, very, very considerable until the year 2000. And then, or 98 or 99, and then, as you see, it tapers off a little bit, which is worrying. Then, what happened? What happened is that since the production increased tremendously, the price dropped. And as you see here, the red line is the gasoline price in Rotterdam, the international price of gasoline in Rotterdam. And what you see here is the year 1980, 1990, 2000, 2005. And you see that in 1980, the production of ethanol, and this is corrected for the heat content and all that and so on, it was about 2.5 times the price of gasoline. And then, as economists know very well, as you increase production, which increased tremendously, then the price dropped. And this is the blue line. And you see that in 2004, they did cross. And subsidies disappeared in the Brazilian system. And today, ethanol is cheaper than gasoline because of the recent raise in prices of gasoline. Therefore, it became very popular. And 40% of the gasoline used in Brazil has been displaced by ethanol. And so, and then you say, okay, how can innovation help this system? And this is a very interesting graph in which I picked up about 100 distilleries. All over Brazil, there are about 300 distilleries. It's all big business. Small distilleries did not prosper because of economies of scale and all that and so on. It has some social negative aspects, but what really prospered were large enterprises. These are not all the distilleries. I picked up about 100 of them. And I looked at the productivity of these distilleries. And you see here, there are 3 distilleries which produce between 4,500 and 5,000 liters per hectare, which is very low. Then there are 2 at the right hand, which produce between 10,000 and 10,500. And then this comes from experience. You just go and ask this data exists. And as you see, the average is around between 8,000 and 8,500. But there are better ones. So the great challenge now is how to push this curve to the right. And this is what the state of São Paulo is trying to do now. Because there are about 80 new distilleries being installed in the state of São Paulo. They are being licensed, and it should increase the production of ethanol in São Paulo by about 50% until the year 2012, in 5 or 6 years, approximately. And they are all new. And what we are trying to do is to encourage them to improve the technology used, both in the agricultural sector and in the industrial sector. So this curve will move to the right. And there is a lot of room for progress, as you see, using today's technology, which means better industrial systems and better selection of species and all that and so on. And in principle, one could gain about 25% in the productivity if all or most of the distilleries did have a yield of approximately 10,000 liters per hectare. And this is what's going on. And the next step then belongs to the future, and then we shall see. It has to do with genetically modifying sugarcane, today's sugarcane, because people working in this area claim that they could produce sugarcane, traditional sugarcane, which twice the amount of cane per hectare. And then there is second generation, which is there is a hype about second generation for the production of ethanol from cellulose here in this country. I mean, everybody, since corn is probably not able to expand very much, then the idea is to use cellulose. And but that is second generation, and it will require significant technological progress. The situation in Brazil does not require any revolutionary progress, but it requires hard work. So this is the example of innovation. It's happening in the private sector. You know, what's interesting is that the government has very little to do with it. You know, and the number of people involved in innovation is not very large because the producers of the equipment are only 1 or 2. It's Dedini and a few others, very few. It's quite surprising, actually. But the agricultural sector relies heavily on the agricultural schools of the state of São Paulo and of the federal government. So it's not quite an Embraer, but it moves around $10 billion dollars per year. So it's beginning to look like a new Embraer. Thank you.
We conducted our own version of the animal game, or Jogo do Bicho, here at the Wilson Center, and Professor Hill came out with the winning numbers, so he will provide the first commentary.
Bom dia. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this program this morning. It's wonderful to be back here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for even half a day. I spent a very pleasant year here a year ago as a public policy scholar. I attended many such events like this one, and in fact, the problem with being at the Wilson Center is that there is so much to do that's so interesting that you don't actually get any work done. You just learn things. It's a terrific place. I want to second the opening remarks about Dr. Esfandiari and her struggles in Iran. This is a very serious business for all of us, for the Wilson Center, and by the way, for my own institution, George Mason University, where her husband, Professor Shoaib Akash, is a member of our faculty. So we feel doubly concerned for her welfare and for the welfare, what her incarceration means for her family, the institutions they're part of, but also what it means for the relationships between the United States and Iran, and whether this, in some perverse way, opens the possibilities for more constructive dialogue going forward. Early on, Kent mentioned typical American views of Brazil and certain exports of culture, and I just felt I couldn't let it go by without mentioning Antonio Carlos Jobim and his wonderful invention or his interpretation of bossa nova with Stan Getz back when I was a young fellow. This is not a talk about Brazil. I don't know anything about Brazil, but I know something about innovation, and I thought I might try to reflect a little bit on both what was said here this morning and on the very interesting piece of research by Professor Arbex about innovation in Brazil, which probably most of you have not had an opportunity to see. Was that disseminated to everyone, that paper? Okay. Well, then you're at a bit of a disadvantage, but I've had an opportunity to see a recent paper on innovation in Brazil in which a very interesting observation is made that roughly 1,200 companies have emerged in a particular study as being quite different from other companies in Brazil. These are companies that are rapidly growing, that have relatively high productivity growth rates, that pay high wages, whose workers remain employed by the company on average for longer periods of time, that spend more on research and development by a considerable amount than their other companies in the country, and that are showing many of the characteristics of technology-based firms in any country in the world. And on these 1,200 is based a case in this paper for the argument that in a part of the Brazilian industrial economy, innovation is alive and well and thriving. Now, again, you haven't seen the paper, so it's hard for you to relate to what I'm about to say. The paper is a wonderfully descriptive analysis of what's going on in the country. But what it seems to me is missing, and this isn't meant to be critical, but simply an observation on how we must proceed. If a country, whether it be the United States or Finland or Tunisia, wants to enhance its industrial innovation capacity and the performance of its companies, it's important, I believe, to understand that industrial system, to know not only what is going on, but why it's going on and how it's being done. And to that end, what I thought would be very important and interesting to know regarding, on the one hand, this set of 1,200 companies that are doing much better than the rest, and then some selected set of matched other companies not doing so well in these terms, is something about why these differences exist, because it lies in those explanations the design of an appropriate innovation policy for a country. A striking thing about these firms is that they are larger than average. That's quite different from what we now believe to be the case in the United States, or in parts of Europe and increasingly even in Japan and other Asian countries, which is that innovative performance is higher among a group of small firms. In fact, public policy toward innovation in the United States, I would argue, is rather obsessed these days with the notion that innovation happens in small, high-technology, entrepreneurial-based firms, and that public policy should encourage, therefore, risk-taking, venture capital, startups, spin-offs, small business incentives, training and investment preferences, and so on. What one would like to know about Brazil is why that model seems not to be the right model for Brazil based on Professor Arbeck's findings. Rather, these are larger firms. I would like to know what sectors they're in, how old they are, how they were initially capitalized, where they got their technologies originally, how they got initiated, who were the founders, what were the educational backgrounds, what were the cultural backgrounds of the founders. Were these persons who were recent immigrants to the country? Were they persons who had studied to the PhD at the finest institutions, the founders of the company? Or were they people perhaps who had maybe a college education, maybe not, and perhaps had studied less glamorous fields like mechanical engineering or business or sociology? The reason these things matter is that our assumptions about the nature of innovation in a place are often incorrect, and particularly countries that are emerging from prior periods of protection, as Brazil is, tend to get enamored of the notion that the pathway to success is to build the strongest possible higher education system, the strongest possible government laboratories, based on the models that are at the top of the pyramid in the United States or Britain or France or Germany, to try to replicate MIT and Cambridge and Heidelberg, and to do it as rapidly as possible. And this is usually, of course, not the best way to proceed at all. It usually diverts attention from real opportunity and real need, and places in charge of policy development and advice a group of people who are specifically and exquisitely ill-trained to offer that advice in an effective way. Brazil is blessed with some very highly visible exceptions to this rule, such as the gentleman to my left, who obviously are not consumed with those kinds of problems. But an empirical study in Brazil of who the entrepreneurial firms are, who their leaderships are, where they came from, how they got started, what are their relationships to foreign firms, customers and suppliers outside the country, and so on, would be remarkably important to do, I think, to move beyond description to hypothesis analysis and prescription. Let me make, if I might then, a few observations about the very interesting presentations that came before. Mr. Avila spoke first about his relationship to my good friend Nicholas Van Nortis and his training at GW. It makes me feel old because I think of Van Nortis as one of the young guys in my field, and here Van Nortis is a mentor to one of the powerful guys in Brazil, and I'm thinking maybe it's time for me to go. I'm not sure.
I consider you quite a young man.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Dr. Hughes is, I look up to him as a very senior member of my community. Mr. Avila spoke of the intellectual property system's key role as a device and mechanism for appropriation of value. And I think that's absolutely correct. And of course, again, given the historical evolution in Brazil from a deliberately weak IP system to building a strong IP system, this makes a great deal of sense. However, I would offer two cautions. One is increasingly we see in the United States and in Japan and in Europe a focus on the contrariness of the IP system and a focus on open source approaches, on systems that, in a sense, have come to view strong intellectual property protection as counterproductive, even from an industrial perspective, that value is generated in open networks of collaborating individuals. Now, perhaps you can't get to open systems until you've had a good, strong, closed system, but I think making sure that there remains room in the new system for openness is important. And the second thing, I think, and it's related to the first about IP, is to keep in mind that it's not only about protection. It's a social bargain made with the producers of knowledge and the users of knowledge, and not just the first producer of knowledge, but the next producer of knowledge, which is that IP, intellectual property protection, is not only about protection, it's also about dissemination. And the social bargain includes not only I hold tight, but in order to be permitted to hold tight, I must give away. I must tell you all in order to protect all. And balancing the protection and dissemination roles of intellectual property in a broader national interest is always important, and I'm sure he's aware of that. I was struck by the very nice historical vignette about the move away from import substitution to an open economy. The United States had its own period of import substitution. We called it Yankee ingenuity, and our patent law did not respect other countries' patents either. We quite openly and deliberately acquired low-cost technology from abroad, meaning we stole methods for making textiles from England and so on. We happily did that for a long time. Alexander Hamilton's program for manufacturing in the United States was, in a sense, an import substitution model that he promoted in 1791. Professor Goldenberg's discussion of ethanol is most interesting, and I very much appreciated your not too thinly veiled criticism of America's corn-based ethanol program, which I think, given the price of tortillas, is clearly moving in the wrong direction. Using food for energy we gave that up when we quit using horses to pull wagons, and I think it's a retrograde move in our country to do that, and perhaps that's a stronger statement than he would be willing to make. But the corn-based ethanol programs in this country only make sense as a political device, not as a technology or science or energy policy. If I can introduce a bit of levity here, back in the 1970s, I was teaching a course in technology assessment, and the 70s were a different time. And one of my students, a very serious and capable chemical engineering undergraduate, was interested in ethanol versus marijuana. And she asked a very reasonable question: how many highs per acre can you get by growing corn to make whiskey and getting high on the whiskey, or growing marijuana on the same property to grow and make cigarettes to smoke to get high on the marijuana? And she discovered, not surprisingly, that marijuana is a much more efficient crop than ethanol in producing highs per acre. And she developed the graphs of highs per acre for the technologies then available. And I was thinking it's too bad, since it's high time, as Professor Goldenberg said, that we can't figure out how to run our cars on marijuana, which might have an even higher. Actually, it wouldn't if you do the math. It gets people high, but it wouldn't run cars very well. I would say, though, that both countries need to be very alert to the real risks of both soil exhaustion and monoculture associated with deep dependence on the crops for energy. Crops grow on an annual basis, or maybe on a twice-a-year basis, depending on the growing region, and are highly susceptible to disease. And as we optimize on the genetic properties of either corn or sugarcane for the production of ethanol, it seems to me we're raising the stakes for a massive embargo, an embargo caused not by the Arab members of OPEC, but by some errant fungus or rust or other disease that could wipe out an entire year's or more production of these fuels. And for that, we need a lot of research to ensure that the systems are stable against, not against foreign despots, but against the diseases that are always a major challenge to human life. Thank you.
Before I call on Mr. Atkinson, I want to emphasize that the cannabis versus cachaça conundrum is not a research topic at the Wilson Center.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Kent and Paolo. It's very nice to be here, and I will, like Chris, know almost nothing about Brazil, so this has been a very useful morning for me as well, just to learn more. And I'll comment. My comments will be partly based on the speakers this morning, and then also based on this paper that we were kind enough to get a copy of. I mean, let me just, I guess, start with sort of some overarching comments, and then to talk a little bit about some issues around industrial strategy and what that implies. First of all, I think much of what we heard, much of what I read in the paper is all to the good. Hearing about Brazil developing what one might call an American-based IP system, I think it's a good thing. I think it'll be good for Brazil in terms of their ability to develop IP more effectively, and I think it'll be good for the world economy in the sense that stronger IP protection, I think, is a good thing. I actually come back to that. I disagree a little bit with Chris. I think that you can have strong IP and open innovation at the same time. I think the real risk to the IP regime is countries that just simply don't respect it. Also, the shift, I guess import substitution may have worked. I find it sort of hard to believe it would work today, and it's obviously Brazil has come to the same conclusion. Sort of always struck me as sort of a bit, frankly, sort of strange notion that you want to somehow, that you like imports and you don't like imports and you like exports. And it just seems to me you have your economy just to produce consumer value, but that's a different issue. But anyway, so Brazil obviously moving in the right direction, moving away from an old kind of protectionist, mercantilist strategy towards a more open globalist strategy. I think, again, that's good for Brazil. I think it's good for the U.S. And I also think ultimately when we're talking about these innovations in Brazil, those all are ultimately good for Brazil and good for the world. I think, talk about the Brazilian ethanol miracle, if you will. That's great. I think it shows both that Brazil can do this, that other countries can do this. So I think all that's good, and I think the richer Brazil gets, the faster Brazil gets rich, the better off, again, they will be, and the better off the world will be. I think we all have a stake in countries like Brazil getting a higher standard of living as fast as possible. I don't see any kind of zero-sum or negative-sum activities here. I think wealth is ultimately unlimited, and it's just a question of human ingenuity to get there. Now, I want to sort of comment on a couple of things on the strategy. The paper that Chris mentioned was talking about, and to some extent the comments we heard this morning, talking about Brazil moving up the value chain and getting into more innovation-based, high-value-added, high-skill activities. And the paper sort of alluded to the fact that Brazil was producing more in the commodity, mid-level, low-level innovation, productivity, technology sectors, and that there was somehow a problem with that. And I guess I would take a little bit of exception to that. I think that one way to think about the global economy today is that there's essentially a global division of labor going on. And that certain parts of the globe specialize in certain parts of the production process. And this was true in the old economy. I actually talk about this in my book, that we had that same sort of division of labor production in the U.S. economy when we were pre-global, pre-1980 economy, when we were largely a national economy. Brazil was a national economy with its import substitution strategy. Most regions were national. They weren't global. And we had that same kind of division of labor. We had commodity-based, low-wage, less skilled, less technology-intensive production in the South. It was largely a branch plant region, the South, the Southwest, parts of the Upper Plains states. And the innovation activities in the U.S. largely took place in the Northeast, the Midwest to some extent, and the West. Now what's happened is we've moved to a global economy. That kind of division of labor, that kind of spatial division of labor, if you will, now is playing out around the world. And Brazil, if you will, is doing the kinds of activities that the southern United States did 30 years ago. I don't see anything wrong with that, frankly. I think the notion that every region somehow can be or should be an R&D based region, like, let's say, Massachusetts or California, I think it's just. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to get there, even if every country were to focus on innovation exclusively. The amount of sort of products and services that are going to be technology based in the global economy is inherently limited, and there's inherent limitations on sort of how much of that there's going to be. So I guess I understand why Brazil wants to move up the value chain. You get higher wages with that and all. But I guess I would caution that somebody's got to do commodity-based production. One of the points that the paper makes is they talk about the average education levels of workers in these three types of companies. And it looks like the average education level of the Brazilian worker is about 8 years. That doesn't strike me as being an awfully high level of education. You compare that to the U.S., where average education levels are more along the lines of 14 years. We now have 65% of Americans that go to college. So inherently, if you think about it sort of that way, we inherently will specialize in activities that require more education and more innovation, and countries with less skilled workers will specialize in lower levels. I also want to come to this point, which I think is a sort of broader point on. It's striking to me how almost every country now sees their path to prosperity largely through a sort of the same kind of narrow focused strategy. And I think it's problematic that's what's going on. And that strategy, there's essentially two ways you can get rich in an economy. And they're both related to raising productivity. That is the only way an economy gets rich. You produce more per hour the next year than you produced for the first year. But there are two ways to do that. You can, first of all, you can change your industrial mix. So you can say we want to get rid of T-shirt factories and substitute them with semiconductor factories. Semiconductor factories are 3, 4, 5 times more productive, more higher value added per worker than a T-shirt factory. So if you get rid of T-shirt factories and you import all your T-shirts and you shift to your production to semiconductors, you've raised your productivity. Well, there's a second way to raise productivity, which is to say you'll keep your T-shirt factory, but you will help raise productivity in the T-shirt factory. So you might use a program like the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program in the U.S. And train workers to make better T-shirts and use new capital equipment, and therefore you would raise your productivity. Which strategy is a better strategy? I think the answer is very, very clear. If you're a large country, the strategy that is a better strategy is to raise productivity in the T-shirt factory. Or in this case, in the case of the U.S., 84% of U.S. production now is not in manufacturing, but it's in services. So the reason why the U.S. Has been leading the world in productivity growth, with productivity rates of double of what Europe has had in the last 12 years, it's not because we happen to have more semiconductor plants or more software, that we do, and that's important, but it's because we've used technology in all of our sectors. I was just over in India giving a talk to the Confederation of Indian Industry, and I commented that one of the things India has done, I think, I know this is a Brazil discussion, but let me make this, I think, parallel. India has a policy that says we want to become a leader in computer production and semiconductor production, all those good things. So what they do is they've slapped very high tariffs on IT imports, and they have this very disturbing and protectionist or mercantilist tax system that tax foreign companies more than taxes domestic companies, and it's all this kind of centrally planned industrial policy to win in the computer sector. Okay, we can say, well, that's all well and good. Maybe they'll get some computer companies there. They might, but the real impact of that policy, and I'm citing an Indian study by 2 Indian economists, is to raise the prices of IT inputs and to reduce the use of IT through the rest of the economy. So if you go and look at the Indian economy, the amount of IT used in the banking sector, the retail sector, all these other sectors, which is really where the productivity gains will come from, is very, very low. And it's because of this sort of misguided policy that they're going to focus on the production side and not on the use side. So I guess I would argue that I worry that countries that we're all sort of focusing on this very narrow sort of set of, not just manufacturing alone, but a very narrow set of manufacturing that's, quote, high tech. We're all going after the same thing and missing the real opportunities for growth and for prosperity, which is domestic productivity. Again, I've never been to Brazil, although I'd love to go. I've been to Chile. But I'll use my other Indian example. India is, and I use it because I think it's emblematic of the same sort of inclination towards mercantilism that I think, frankly, Brazil has. We just released a report called The Rise of the New Mercantilist, Unfair Trade Practices in the Innovation Economy, which is on our website. And there are a number of practices that Brazil engages in that I would consider, frankly, unfair. And I think it's important as we go forward in the global economy that we need to distinguish between kinds of practices and policies in innovation policy that are essentially win-win, that everybody benefits from. So, to the extent that Brazil sees a niche, let's say in ethanol, or decides it wants to expand its universities or do better patent policy or put in place an R&D tax credit. All of those things to me are very legitimate innovation policies. At the end of the day, Brazil will be better, we'll be better, the world will be better. But unfortunately, that's not the only thing Brazil and other countries are doing. They're engaging in a whole slew of practices that I would just say is downright cheating, downright mercantilist, downright protectionism that discriminate against foreign technology companies in favor of domestic technology companies. Some of those are in the IP space. Drugs are a good example of, I think what's interesting about the U.S. is, we may not be good at commodity production anymore, but the thing we're really, really good at are things with a lot of intellectual property in them and things that can be stolen, which happen to be very easily stealable. So software, drugs, books, music, movies, all of that. And you look at the level of software theft in Brazil and other countries, it's quite high. Drug theft, if you will, sort of taking our drugs and using them as generics. There are rules in Brazil, for example, around forced technology transfer in joint ventures. And I don't mean to be overly critical. I think Brazil is doing what, frankly, most countries would do, and I'd do it if I were them too. It's just, Chris alluded to earlier, the U.S. used to do this, back in the Alexander Hamilton days, or even later in the 1820s, 1840s, when we stole plans from the British textile mills. In fact, Rhode Island, where I was before, it was the first textile mill in America. It was set up in Rhode Island by a guy named Samuel Slater, who came to New York, stole the plans from the Arkwright textile mill in Britain, which was a capital offense. If he had been caught, he would have been executed. Came to the U.S., went to Moses Brown, who was a slave trader, got capital from that, and invested in the first textile mill. Yeah, that was mercantilism. That was a theft of IP. But one big difference, though. We weren't in the WTO. We hadn't signed TRIPS. Okay, if you want to be in the WTO and you sign TRIPS, you don't have to do that. If you don't want to do that and you want to steal IP, okay. But if you're in the WTO and you sign TRIPS, that means you have some obligations. And what worries me is I see a lot of countries out there that think they can basically have it both ways. Let's get access to that big, sweet, juicy U.S. market, and let's not respect IP laws, because it's easier for us to just take software and to force U.S. companies to provide a lot of technology transfer if they want to get access to our market. So again, I don't mean to be overly critical. I in many ways applaud what Brazil is doing, and I am in many ways very, very pleased and optimistic to hear about the technology progress and innovation progress in the country, because as I said, I think that the way we need to go forward in the world, my last point on this is I think we're at a very dangerous point in the global economy right now. We really ought to be in a global system where there are, no, in my view, no tariffs, no trade barriers whatsoever. Government doesn't buy and sell currency. That we really leave these things up to the private sector. And the role of government is not to manipulate markets or distort markets or to encourage or enable IP theft, but rather to help build the key components of the innovation system. Train workers, encourage technology transfer, develop laboratories and universities, good R&D tax credits, things like that. And what I worry about is that that's the hard way to do things. The easy way to do things is the shortcut. And I think that what I see is a lot of countries taking those shortcuts. And when you see that the U.S. trade balance is at the highest level it's ever been in U.S. history, the highest level of any country ever in world history, that essentially is not sustainable. And when you think about countries like Brazil, India, and China, three big, and possibly Russia, 3 or 4 big giant countries who say our strategy is basically an export-led strategy, and who are they exporting to but the U.S., that essentially that model just won't work. And I think we've got to all come to grips with that realization that that's just not a sustainable model. The sustainable model to me is one where countries focus on largely first on domestic productivity, and secondly on kind of this more win-win innovation policies that benefit everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. We're a little bit late, but we're going to take some time for questions before we get to coffee and conversation. The gentleman over here, and if you'll wait until the microphone gets through, there he is right there.
Please identify yourself.
Hugh Schwartz. I'm with the University of the Republic in Uruguay and formerly with the IDB here in Washington. My question certainly doesn't reflect either of these two organizations. It's a follow-up to some of the kinds of questions which were being raised by Professor Hill from the study he was looking at. And it's really addressed to Professors Goldenberg and Avila. To what extent, I think you probably can already think about this and answer this, to what extent has the Brazilian innovation been primarily in response to public policies which have made it more attractive to those in the private sector to take risks than before, so that they've been more inclined to innovate than before? To what extent has it been due to, the innovation been due to public policies which have subsidized the private sector and therefore made it less necessary to think in terms of taking risk, but just subsidize it so that it's like taking no more risk than before to innovate? And to what extent has the innovation in Brazil been due to innovation within the public sector itself, subsidized presumably? Now, I think this is answering this is very important to the kinds of public policies that you want for the future. And where I would take a little bit of objection to Professor Goldenberg's talking about the ethanol thing as an embryo type policy is that was clearly, in the past at least, that was innovation in the public sector. Now that embryo is in the private sector, we'll see to what extent it can continue to innovate. But the answer to these, to which of the 3 types of policies has the innovation really responded, is an important kind of question to answer in determining what kinds of ways to promote innovation in the future.
Well, I'd say if we understand public policy in a broad sense, that much of the shift in industry behavior have to do with policy initiatives. If we understand that moving from a closed economy to an open economy is a policy decision, and I think that this was the major, what really made companies decide to innovate. They needed to. They could not compete the way they used to compete before the economy was open to external competition. And I'd like to make some short comments on the comments. if it's possible, really very short. And this has something to do with this. And the question of, first of all, the question of innovation as a choice that excludes traditional sector development, commodity production, and so on. We really don't see it that way. We think that innovation is a horizontal policy. And it addresses all sectors, not only high-tech sectors. Ethanol is an example. It's a very traditional product, primary product, almost, and we have a very deep concern with innovation in ethanol production. What we see everywhere is that innovation is a basic tool for competition in all the sectors. This is the basic rationale on the design of the new industrial policy. The idea of an industrial policy is not like in the past, the idea of choosing sectors. It's the idea of building an environment where industry can prosper. So it's a policy oriented to a great measure to the government decisions themselves, in order to have a concern on building such an environment. Of course, we have some traditional tools, like public financing for exports, as every country has. I'd say that the mercantilistic approach, unfortunately, is present in most of the countries' policies. And most of at least to some extent, in every country, as a response to mercantilistic approaches of other countries. When we talk about IP, a strong system, a strong IP system. To our understanding, a strong IP system is a system which provides juridical security. In this sense, it should be strong, not in the sense that the protection is enormous, and all these things. The system has to provide the actors enough certainty of the contracts they firm. This is the rules must be well known. The rules must be clear. And in this is the direction we are pursuing. Of course, the things are not linear, and some facts may be appointed as, look, you're doing things which do not match with this orientation. Maybe one another. I'd say that there are exemptions. The basic direction of the policy is to make the rules clear, and the system is not being built with a mercantilistic approach. I'd say that, for instance, when you talk about juridical security, the American system is not a good example. Many of the American patents they fall in the courts. And a decision of the Supreme Court, very recent, is producing changes in the USPTO behavior. And this is very good from our standpoint. In the sense we believe strength is important in AP systems, American system is improving. And so I think it's a good thing for the world. I'd say that some of the practices of weakness of IP systems in this country have to do with a mercantilistic approach. I would use the example of Embraer. Embraer has had many problems, many trouble in exporting to the United States because of patent deals. And at least under the view of Embraer lawyers, those patents have no value. If they challenge them in court, they would win. But these would take years and millions of dollars. Then it was a non-trade barrier, the weak patent system in this country. So we saw with we were very happy with these recent shifts. And I think that this opens the possibility of much stronger cooperation between the United States and Brazil in the subject of intellectual property innovation. And I think that to overpass this mercantilistic approach is an international task. As I think to build a win-win commercial environment is something that all the countries should be engaged in. And we are very sad when we look at WTO negotiations that they don't prosper, that these things don't. I think it's a mutual failure. And I think we have the opportunity to improve it. That's it. Thank you.
Professor Goldenberg, did you have a comment?
No, it's a very short comment. What happened with ethanol happened with all renewable technologies around the world. They face very stiff competition from fossil fuels, which were abundant and were not very expensive either. So it required public policies. This is why wind was developed in Denmark or Germany or California. And so clearly there was a protection system. But in the case of ethanol, I think what's attractive is that the only thing that the government did was to create a market, through a subsidized price. It created a market. And then capitalism took over. Smart people have, as you see in that curve that I showed, smart people have very efficient distilleries, and dumb people have very inefficient distilleries, So some of them are making much more money than others. And so you say, well, subsidies are a bad thing, distort economy and all that and so on. But these are the externalities of the present system, because of environmental considerations. And governments are doing that all over the place, including the United States.
Thank you. The lady in the back and then the lady in the front. If you could, again, please identify yourself and give us your institutional affiliation.
Yeah, Sue Cronin, I'm with USGR. I have a really simple question for all of those of you who have read the paper that no one else has seen. Did it address the effect of bankruptcy laws on risk takers? Because that seems to me key in Brazil.
Well, a fair answer to your question is I don't believe bankruptcy law is mentioned at all. In fact, the paper is not about risk-taking. I'm sorry? It's about innovation, and those should not be made equal. This whole risk-taking thing is perhaps a little bit upside down in the following sense, that innovation thrives when risk-taking is at that sort of optimal level. And too little risk on corporations leads to lack of innovation. The big risk for a corporation is the risk of failure, bankruptcy, and disappearance. And innovation is an appropriate response in the face of that risk. So to reduce the risks on companies is not a good idea if the purpose is to encourage innovation. You want to enhance the risk they face in the marketplace, be sure they're subject to the creative winds of destruction, and hope that some of them survive. If they all survive, you've got a bad policy, et cetera. So we get our ideas about risk usually about half upside down, and we've got to be really careful about that.
Just 1 second. Just make one clarification. It's my fault. The mysterious paper. I'll send it to you if you want it. It's by Glauco Arbix, who would like to be here. It's a comparative study on Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, on innovations from last year, and I will send it. I'll ask actually his permission. We'll probably post it, but that's it. But I'll send to you.
Just add my own thought on bankruptcy, that there is a body of thought here which I more or less subscribe to, that the relative ease of bankruptcy in the United States allows you to start, make a mistake, fail, and start over again with some ease. And certainly it supports, I think, a culture here where failure is not losing your shirt in a particular venture. It's really, real failure is not trying again. So the classic Silicon Valley example that's often cited is the millionaire who became a millionaire on his or her 7th try. So I think these institutional factors can, in general, interact with a cultural predisposition. The lady in front, please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation.
Nancy Bierstecker, of late for the Chafee Center for International Business, Rhode Island. My question has to do with the, as we all know, the growth, massive growth of China and to a certain extent India, in light of their two-tiered or maybe multiple development along all levels of the value chain, from low-level commodity production to high-tech, whatever, but the state support for that and the massive amount of capital that is made available for R&D, for innovation and commercialization. What is a country like Brazil, or the U.S. for that matter, going to do when much of our initiative comes through the private sector?
I think that China is probably the biggest challenge, and its development has much to do with the choice for a very strong innovation policy. We have seen that at least in the basic commodity sector, no chance. So this is going to be Chinese. And when we are talking not about agrarian manufacture, but about manufacture, basic manufacturing. So we are not abandoning textiles, for instance. We understand that we need to invest in fashion, and we have a very we understand innovation in a very broad sense. And we have an example which we have been using, and there are many others. But the small sandal, which has become very fashionable, especially in Europe. And this innovation, in the sense that it's been just a simple sandal, was transformed in a desired consumer product. And so this is a kind of innovation, not high-tech, not technology-based innovation, but it's market innovation, marketing practices innovation. And so we are trying to deal with this. The idea is that we need to compete with the Chinese monster, to have an innovative approach to industrial development and to the policy, which somehow has the objective of show possibilities, open opportunities, help in the various senses governments can help, which are always limited, but exist. This is.
I guess I would add, I don't think that it's I don't think it's accurate to say that somehow we can't compete in commodities. I think the U.S. can compete in commodity production, if you will. I was talking to an engineer from a German company that was a spin-off of BMW, and he and I were on the plane together coming back from India, and I was asking what he does, what's he doing there. He says, well, we produce, they produce ball bearings, and they're like one of the world's leading producer of ball bearings, and he produces some in India. I said, what are you producing in India? He goes, what we're producing in India is old ball bearings for old models where the demand is 500 a year or whatever like that. It's just labor intensive. We can't afford to do it in Germany. What we produce in Germany is we have these machines that produce 600,000 a day or something. It's an unbelievable amount, completely, totally automated, the most high-tech facility you can imagine. That production, ought to be in Germany. Similarly, that kind of production ought to be in the U.S. I think it's important when you talk about China, and to some extent other countries, but China to me is the worst on this. There are lots and lots of things that have gone to China that shouldn't have gone there if the market were setting the price of currency. The Chinese currency is easily undervalued by 30%. I was talking to a CEO of a company just closed a factory in North Carolina, moved to China. I said, I understand what you got to do that. You got shareholders and all that stuff. But I said, what was the cost differential when you factor in higher U.S. productivity and the fact that Chinese workers are very unskilled? In India, we hear about India as being this high tech. Everybody has a PhD, and 90% of Indians don't graduate from high school. They just happen to have so many people that they can produce a lot of PhDs. But most people don't even graduate from high school. So anyway, he said to me, well, we're about 25% cost differential from moving that factory from North Carolina, even with the higher wages in North Carolina to China. You take away the yuan subsidy of at least 30%, that factory would still be in North Carolina. So I just want to make clear, I'm not arguing that we should keep factories in North Carolina that don't belong in North Carolina. What I am arguing for is that those decisions should be made in the marketplace, not by governments. And when you have massive government subsidies that the Chinese are engaged in, I think it hurts Brazil. I think it hurts Europe. I think it hurts us. They're this huge outlier. When you combine the currency subsidies with the direct production subsidies, the amount of money they're giving Intel, the amount of money they give these plants, combined with import tariffs, combined with standards, combined with the whole system is basically a mercantilist engine. I think it's a fundamental distortion of the trading system, and I think it eventually will hurt Brazil. I think if it's not already. And I think we all ought to basically get together and say enough is enough. These decisions should be made by companies.
I think you raise a very, very serious question. In the U.S., I think about 2/3 of the money spent on research and development, mostly toward the development side, is in the private sector. And we either will have to change the world rules, have some enforcement with regard to currency manipulation and so forth, or you may see the United States also becoming a bit more interventionist and having a more active role for the government as it seeks to level what is now a very unlevel playing field. And if you could please introduce yourself.
Arvin Bunker from Whiteman Associates. We do economic development in foreign countries. And it wasn't clear from Mr.
We may need your help here, too, I think.
We could change some policies here. It's not clear to me that Brazil ever discontinued an import substitution policy, and maybe it's just a switch in the commodities to which it is applied. Would you convince me otherwise?
Well, the traditional import substitution approach has some elements, and I really see none of them in the current industrial policy. This means that there's no control on technology transfer. There's absolutely no restrictions to imports, but tariffs and non-tariff barriers are being very quickly disappearing. And you have a much stronger effort of fostering companies to engage into the international markets than any other thing. If you take a look at the figures of Brazil in the last 10 years, I think that this is the basic argument. You'll see that imports have grown in about 10 times, and exports about 20 times. So when you have an import substitution approach, imports diminish. Imports don't grow. And so I think this is the basic argument. So imports have grown strongly. The total amount of trades between Brazil and other countries has produced 10 times growth. So this is, we really have there's no trace of import substitution policy in Brazil nowadays.
Let's make this the last question, if we may. Again, please introduce yourself.
Mario Winterstein, the Association for Manufacturing Technology. In your answer, Mr. Avila, to that question, it's a follow-up. How do you then explain two things? One, the law of similarities to reduce import duties, and in which capital equipment have to pay 14% import duties, which then in the system of taxation and fees ends up being about 55% of the value of the import. And how do you conciliate that with the load of fees and taxes for anything that's imported that actually makes it a premium to invest the same piece of equipment in Brazil of about 35% if compared with other countries like India, China, or even Argentina?
Well, I'm not a specialist in tariffs, but I'd say that every country has some differences. No country practices homogeneous tariffs on imports. And this has much to do with the internal dynamics of the industries of these countries. If you take a look at what has been happening to the medium level of import tariffs in Brazil, it has reduced dramatically. I cannot speak of any particular sectoral. I really don't have not much information. But what I do know is that the average level of import taxation has diminished dramatically.
Can I just make one comment on that? I'm not familiar with those tariffs, but it doesn't surprise me. To me, if you're going to put tariffs on a product, which I don't think you should, or a service, yeah, you're much better off doing it on the current consumer side. The worst thing you can do is put a tariff on capital equipment, whether that's a computer or a machine tool. That is the driver. I mean, there's clear consensus in the economic community that that is the #1 driver of economic growth. Not the production of machine tools, but the use of machine tools, or the use of software, the use of computers. That's where you're going to get growth from. And I do think many countries miss that fundamental point, and they say, oh, we're going to get our own computer sector, we're going to get our own capital goods sector. They slap these big tariffs on it, and they get this little teeny gain over here in the capital goods sector and this huge loss over here in the user sector. And I think we've just got to do a better job of making it clear that this is a bad strategy. It just doesn't work.
Well, I want to thank you for stimulating questions and an outstanding panel. Would you please join me in a round of applause? We have run a little over. This was such a rich conversation that we now have a little time for coffee and conversation. I'm going to ask you all to limit it to 10 minutes, and it will